Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I remember the exact moment the alert tone cut through the radio in my truck. I was parked on the shoulder of County Route 17, halfway through a routine inspection report. Engine idling. Paperwork spread on the passenger seat. The sky over Baypoint was overcast, that flat grey that makes everything look like it is already fading out. I had just finished checking a small substation feeder and was about to drive back toward the city when the emergency tone repeated 3 times, sharp and mechanical. "This is a national emergency alert," the announcer said. "All residents in Baypoint and surrounding townships are ordered to report to designated evacuation centers. Repeat, this is a mandatory evacuation order. Proceed to Baypoint Civic Complex for check-in and transport." I sat there with my hand on the steering wheel, listening to the same instruction looping. The announcer's voice sounded steady in that professional broadcast way, but there was a tightness in the pauses, a forced control you only notice when you have heard real panic before. I had heard it in the headset audio from an industrial accident years ago when a power transformer blew and put me on my back, leaving my hearing half ruined in my left ear. After that day, I had trouble ignoring the small changes in tone when people tried to sound calm. On another station, a different voice repeated similar instructions. They used the same words: mandatory, immediate, orderly. The last word did not match what I had seen in the last 3 days. The reanimation story had started as a strange flu. That is what they called it initially. People got fevers, became disoriented, then collapsed. Hospitals filled. The first story that did not fit came from a nurse I knew at Baypoint General, Olivia Shaw. She'd sent me a short text 2 days earlier. "They are getting back up, Eli, after they flatline. Something is wrong." I had stared at the words for a long time and then set the phone face down on my kitchen counter. I kept working because that was what I knew how to do. Inspect the substations, check the fences, run tests on the insulators, fill out forms, pretend that the world of circuits and pumps and valves would keep functioning if I kept doing my part. Now the government was telling everyone to gather in one place. My first instinct was to do the opposite. Consolidating frightened people into a single location during a spreading infection felt like inviting trouble. But every station, every feed, every banner across the bottom of every screen said the same thing. Report to evacuation centers. Bring minimal belongings. Do not stay in your homes. I turned off the ignition. The engine ticked as it cooled. Out in the fields, the wind moved through the tall grass. Somewhere, far off toward the city, I heard a faint siren. If I stayed out here, I would be alone, far from any organized help, with a nearly empty fuel tank and no clear idea of what the government planned to do next. If I went to the evac center, at least I would know what was happening. Maybe I would even be useful. They would need infrastructure people, I told myself. Someone had to keep generators running, coordinate water. I started the truck again and pulled back onto the road. It took me nearly an hour to reach Baypoint Civic Complex. By the time I got there, the entire area around the sports arena and the adjacent fairgrounds had become a maze of cars, buses, and people on foot. Law enforcement patrol cars blocked side streets, their light bars flashing without sirens. Military trucks, real ones, marked with unit numbers and covered beds, sat in lines, engines running. The radio repeaters on the trucks crackled non-stop. I could make out fragments as I inched forward. Arrival times, transport schedules, status checks on Corridor 3 and Corridor 4. The corridors were the highways out of the city, I realized. They were treating them like arteries, trying to keep them open. A National Guard soldier with a reflective vest and a megaphone walked between the lanes, giving the same instructions. "Stay in your vehicles. You will be processed. Have your identification ready. Leave large items. Priority is bodies, not belongings. Stay calm. I rolled my window down when he passed. Hey, I called out. Where exactly are you moving people? North? South? He glanced in, saw my utility company badge clipped to my jacket, and pointed toward the big electronic sign that usually advertised concerts and sports events. Today, it showed a simple message: evacuation destination to be announced. Follow instructions. They'll tell everyone when they load the buses, he said. His eyes were red around the edges. Keep it moving, sir. I pulled forward another car length. A woman in a minivan to my right was crying quietly, while two children in the back seat played with a tablet that had lost its connection to anything. Ahead of me, someone had tried to bring a small trailer loaded with boxes and a household refrigerator, which now blocked part of the lane. Overhead, a helicopter passed low, the sound of its rotors thudding in my damaged ear. By the time I reached the edge of the civic complex parking lots, it was clear the original plan was already breaking down. The lots were full. Cars had been diverted onto the grass. People had abandoned vehicles on the side of the road and walked. Clusters of luggage, boxes, and trash bags sat piled where their owners had been told to leave them. I finally parked on a strip of dirt between a service road and a chain-link fence. As soon as I stepped out, the sound hit me. Thousands of voices, engines, and loudspeakers all competing. My damaged ear turned it into a blur, a constant pressure. My good ear tried to make sense of it, picking out stray words. Registration, medical, priority, families first. I locked the truck more out of habit than necessity and joined the flow of people moving toward the largest arena building. Soldiers guided us with gestures, pointing us into lines that snaked back and forth in the parking lot. Portable tents had been set up as checkpoints. I saw a large Red Cross banner over one, a triage sign over another. A woman with a clipboard intercepted me near the entrance to one of the lines. "Are you alone?" she asked. "Yes." "Any symptoms?" She listed them: fever, confusion, recent bites or injuries from unknown sources. She said the last part fast, as if trying not to bring attention to it. "No," I said. "I'm fine." She scanned my ID with a handheld device, pressed a paper bracelet around my wrist, and wrote a code on it with a marker. "You're Group C," she said. "Follow the blue flags. Stay with your group. Do not leave the line unless instructed." "Where are we going?" I asked. "Transport staging," she said, already looking at the next person in line. We moved slowly. It felt like being at a concert, but no one was smiling and no music played. Instead, large screens mounted on portable stands showed looping public information videos. How to recognize early symptoms. What to do if someone collapsed. Reminders not to panic. The faces in the videos looked calm and confident, filmed weeks or months earlier, before the numbers on the bottom of the screen had started doubling every day. As the sun began to sink behind the parking garages, loudspeakers crackled overhead. A senior official in a suit spoke from a temporary podium near the main entrance, his image projected on the big screens. "Baypoint residents," he said. "The situation is serious, but under control. The reanimation pathogen." He paused for a fraction of a second on the word reanimation, as if it tasted strange. "Has affected certain parts of the region more heavily than others. This evacuation is a precaution. You will be transported to secure facilities outside the impact zone. Please follow all instructions from law enforcement and military personnel. We are committed to your safety." I looked at the soldiers lining the area in front of the podium. None of them looked at the screens. They watched the crowd. A woman somewhere behind me shouted, "My husband never made it home. They said he was discharged. Where is he?" Her voice broke. No one answered. The first sign that the pathogen had reached the evac center came just after full dark. I was near the front of the Group C line by then, just inside one of the arena's service entrances, where a concrete hallway sloped downward. They had us in single file, moving past another checkpoint where nurses checked foreheads with infrared thermometers. The air smelled like sweat and hand sanitizer and damp clothing. There was a commotion from the registration area to our left. A man screamed. Something heavy crashed into a metal barrier. For a second, the lines wavered as people tried to see what was happening. The soldier at the head of our line shouted for everyone to face forward, but his voice shook. I saw it over the shoulders of the people ahead of me, a figure on the ground, then up again, moving in a way that did not match the usual. Limbs jerky, head tilted, mouth open. Another person fell, flailing, and the people nearest them tried to back away, only to be blocked by the rest of the crowd. "Medical!" someone yelled. "We need medical!" The nurse at our checkpoint lowered her thermometer and stared. Her face had gone very pale. The soldier stepped away from our line, hand on his sidearm. He radioed something I could not fully hear over the rising noise, but I caught one word: breach. I had been reading the incident reports. I had seen the early descriptions they tried to keep out of the public view. There was always that word: breach. In isolation wards, in quarantine zones, on hospital floors. Breach meant the barriers between the sick and the well had failed. The hallway beyond the registration area closed into a choke point. Whoever had designed this evac setup had tried to control the flow of people by narrowing the pathways. It made sense on paper, fewer angles of approach, easier to monitor, but it also turned the interior into a funnel. Now that funnel was backing up fast. The first shot echoed off the concrete. It was a short, sharp crack. People screamed and ducked. More soldiers rushed in from side corridors, barking orders. I saw one raise a rifle and fire a short burst toward the ground, where the original figure had been. The body jerked, then stilled. Another figure was already dragging itself along the floor, getting up in that same unnatural way. The soldier fired again. "Back up! Back up now!" someone yelled behind me, but there was nowhere to go. The line ran shoulder to shoulder. We pressed against each other, the entire group swaying. My damaged ear converted the chaos into a dull roar. My good ear picked up snatches of radio traffic. "We have active cases in the civilian staging area. Secure this corridor. We are not cleared for that. Repeat, we are not cleared." The lights flickered. Somewhere deeper inside the arena, a generator kicked in with a growl. The screens in the main hall went dark, taking the reassuring face of the official with them. For a long minute, everything seemed to pause at a tipping point, balance between control and collapse. Then it slid. Someone in the crowd started to move without waiting for orders. A family with 2 kids shoved past the blue rope barrier and ran toward a side door. Others followed. The line lost its shape. The soldier near me tried to push people back, but as more bodies pressed forward, his control disappeared. A plastic barrier snapped. The entire formation broke open like a dam. I did not join the surge. Instead, I stepped out of the line sideways, trying to find space. When you spend years walking around heavy machines and energized equipment, you develop a reflex for looking for exits, for open ground, for places where you will not be crushed if something fails. That reflex took over now. To my right, a service hallway branched off, marked "Maintenance Personnel Only." The door was held open by a wedge. A cart loaded with cleaning supplies sat just inside it. No one was watching it. I slipped through. The hallway beyond was narrow and dimly lit, lined with grey doors labelled with zone numbers. The noise from the main corridor dulled as the door swung shut behind me. I stood there for a second, hands on my knees, breathing faster than I realised. My heart pounded. My left ear rang in a high tone. A voice echoed faintly from somewhere down the hall. A worker's voice, surprised. "Hey, you're not supposed to be in..." Then the main hallway erupted. The sound of people screaming rolled down the vent shafts like distant surf. I heard more shots, then a heavier boom, something larger than a rifle. The worker's voice stopped. I moved. I followed the wall, counting doors, until I found one labelled "Mechanical Access." This would be where they kept the guts of the building: pumps, air handlers, electrical panels. It was locked, but the lock was an older mechanical one, and I had the skills and tools to deal with it. My hand shook only a little as I took my small inspection kit from my jacket pocket and worked the cylinder. Another boom shook dust from the ceiling. By the time the screaming started again, closer now, the lock turned. Inside, the mechanical room was a maze of pipes and equipment. A low hum vibrated through the floor from the remaining power feeds. Emergency lights cast everything in a dull red glow. I shut the door and locked it behind me. For a while, I simply leaned against the cool metal of a control cabinet and listened. The sounds outside came and went, running footsteps overhead, voices shouting orders, something heavy striking metal, another distant burst of automatic fire. Sometimes, all I heard was the building itself, air moving in ducts, coolant circulating, the muted vibration of generators. It was almost comforting. Machines were honest. They either worked or they did not. They did not promise to save you and then withdraw without warning. I do not know how much time passed before the noise outside changed. The sharp activity faded. In its place came a more irregular pattern. Occasional bangs, a shout, then long stretches of silence. It felt like when a storm moves on but leaves behind the sound of water dripping everywhere. I knew I could not stay in that room forever. At some point, the generators would run out of fuel or someone would come looking. I needed to understand what had happened. On the far side of the mechanical room, I found a hatch labelled Service Corridor Access. It opened to a narrow space running parallel to the main building. I remembered seeing similar layouts in other arenas I had inspected over the years. Service corridors like this allowed staff to move around behind the public areas. They also connected to exterior utility rooms. I moved carefully, my work boots quiet on the concrete. The emergency lights here were dimmer, spaced farther apart. Every sound stood out, my own breathing, the distant drip of water, a faint electrical buzz. At the end of the corridor, a metal door with a small wide glass window led outside. I stepped up to it, shielded my eyes from the emergency light and looked through. The parking lots that had been packed with people and vehicles only hours earlier were in disarray. Some cars had their doors hanging open. Luggage lay scattered. A few tents had been knocked flat. The overhead floodlights that usually illuminated events here were off, leaving most of the area in darkness. The only light came from the glow of a few scattered fires and the distant beam of a searchlight sweeping slowly across the sky. I did not see any organized lines. I did not see any buses. I did not see any crowds. I saw movement, slow, irregular. Shapes moved between cars, sometimes bumping into them, sometimes climbing over fallen objects. From this distance, it was hard to be sure what I was seeing, but the patterns were wrong for normal human movement. There was no clear direction, no coordination, just wandering. I recognized the posture from the hospital footage I had watched in training clips. Reanimated individuals did not move like people who were sick or tired. They moved like people whose balance and spatial awareness had been reset to something unfamiliar, as if their bodies were relearning how to walk. I stepped back from the window. The military had pulled out. They had not moved us. They had left. Part of me still wanted to believe that this was a temporary relocation, that they had been forced to retreat and would come back. But I had seen the overhead view of the evac center on the way in. It had been a bottleneck. If the infection reached it, trying to hold it would be a losing battle. The simplest way to prevent further spread from here would be to contain the entire site, including everyone inside it. I pictured being on a list somewhere as evacuated while I was actually still here, and felt a hollow space open up in my chest. I needed information. I needed to know how wide the quarantine was, whether there was still power outside the complex, whether help was still coming from any direction. The mechanical room had a small desk with a phone and a local control terminal. The phone line was dead, but the terminal was still connected to the arena's internal network. I logged in using the generic maintenance credentials that, in my line of work, had become second nature. The system status screen showed more red than green. Multiple subsystems had gone offline. Fire alarms had triggered in several zones, but the external power feed still showed active. The arena was still connected to the city grid. The generators were only supplementing. I opened the feed monitor for the security cameras and cycled through the views. Most cameras showed empty hallways, discarded bags, and a few abandoned wheelchairs. One camera in a main corridor showed 3 figures moving slowly, bumping into walls. Their clothes were stained. Their mouths were open. When they saw another figure lying on the ground, they moved toward it together, crowding around it in a way that made my stomach tighten. I switched to a different view. The camera overlooking the main lot showed what I had glimpsed through the door. Vehicles randomly placed, luggage and debris everywhere, and scattered figures moving with that same unsteady gait. The timestamp on the corner of the screen blinked. It was just after 2 in the morning. On the far edge of the view, the beam of a spotlight passed overhead, sweeping across the tops of buildings. I switched cameras until I found one aimed toward the source. A military helicopter hovered at a safe distance beyond the complex perimeter, its searchlight panning across the area. It did not descend. It did not lower ropes or ladders. It hovered for several minutes, moving in slow arcs, then turned and flew away, its light shrinking into the distance. I waited for it to come back. It did not. Instead, about 20 minutes later, a different sound reached me, a high mechanical buzzing. I flipped through camera feeds again and saw a small quadrotor drone moving along the evacuation zone's perimeter fence. It followed a preset path, stopping every so often to rotate in place. A loudspeaker on its underside clicked on. "This area is under mandatory quarantine," an automated voice announced. "Do not attempt to leave. Do not approach the perimeter. Any movement beyond the containment line will be considered a threat to public safety. Shelter in place. Assistance will be provided when conditions permit." The drone repeated the message every few minutes as it continued its circuit. Shelter in place, I thought. In what? In the middle of a failed evacuation, surrounded by reanimated people and abandoned equipment, with no clear plan and no evacuation transports coming back. I looked at the schematic of the arena's utility connections on the maintenance terminal. The water supply came from the municipal main. The power came from the closest substation, feeding several civic buildings in this part of Baypoint. Down the road, still within walking distance, I knew there was a decommissioned water treatment plant that had been taken offline a few years earlier when the city upgraded to a newer facility on the other side of town. I had inspected that plant twice. It still had intact sand filters, holding tanks and a small backup generator. It had its own fence and was not close to dense housing. Most importantly, it had been shut down in an orderly way, not abandoned to chaos. If I wanted to shelter in place, that plant was a better choice than hiding in a sports arena that had become a trap. The question was how to get there. The zombies were spread around the lots and streets. They might be confused and slow individually, but in numbers they were dangerous. I had watched the footage from the early incidents. A single reanimated individual could be contained. A group could push down barricades with sheer combined weight, even without understanding that they were doing it. I needed to move quietly, avoid drawing attention, and stay away from sightlines as much as possible. The distance from the civic complex to the old water treatment plant was a little under 2 miles by road. If I cut through the rear service roads, I could reduce my exposure to open spaces, but I would still have to step outside. I scavenged the mechanical room for anything useful. The tool cabinet held a decent selection: wrenches, screwdrivers, insulated pliers. There was a heavy adjustable wrench with a long handle, solid enough to serve as a defensive tool if I had to. I wrapped its handle with duct tape for grip and attached a loop so I could secure it to my belt. The first aid kit was basic, but complete. Bandages, antiseptic wipes, pain relievers, a small flashlight with batteries. I strapped the kit to my side with a length of cord. I found a set of work gloves and put them on. I did not have any firearms, and there were none in the maintenance area. The soldiers had theirs, but I had no desire to go anywhere near them to ask. Before I left, I went back to the camera feeds and watched the movement outside for a while, looking for patterns. The infected wandered, but they seemed to cluster in areas where there had been more noise and activity earlier. Near the main entrances, around the spots where vehicles had been crushed together. The quieter backlots had fewer. Every few minutes, one of them would stop and raise its head, as if listening, then turn towards some sound or motion I could not see. Their reaction times seemed slower than human, but not so slow that you could make careless noise and expect to be safe. When I opened the exterior door from the service corridor, the night air hit me in a rush, cold, carrying the smells of exhaust, burned rubber, and something else that I did not want to name. I stepped out, eased the door closed behind me, and waited in the shadow of the building, listening. The drone's loudspeaker voice drifted faintly from somewhere off to my left, still repeating its message. A dog barked once in the distance, then went silent. The infected in the closest lot shuffled along, their shoes scraping pavement. I moved along the wall, counting my steps. After 15, I reached the corner and looked around it carefully. The rear service road was relatively clear. A few cars had been parked there, mostly staff vehicles and delivery trucks, but they had not been part of the main evacuation flow. One of the trucks had its rear doors open, boxes spilled onto the asphalt. I saw no infected within immediate range. I kept low, using the vehicles as cover, and moved. It felt like one of the drills we used to do during safety training, where we practice moving around live equipment without making contact. My mind slid into that mode, focusing on distances, escape routes, and noise sources. The fear was still there, but it moved to the background, behind the problem solving. At the edge of the civic complex grounds, a chain-link fence marked the property line. A section near the service gate had already been forced down, the metal bent outward. Maybe someone had tried to leave earlier. Now the gap gave me a way out. I ducked through, scanning both directions on the quiet side street beyond. Streetlights still burned, powered by a grid that did not know the people it served were gone or changed. A few cars sat at odd angles, doors open. Power lines hummed overhead. The normal sounds of a city distant traffic, music from bars, voices from open windows were missing. In their place was a kind of hollow stillness, broken only by the occasional distant siren or unexplained crash. I cut across a small park, staying behind trees where I could, and followed a side path I had used many times on my way to inspections. Every shadow felt deeper than before. Every rustle in the bushes made me freeze. Halfway through the park, I saw my first infected up close. He stood near a picnic table, leaning against it as if he had fallen there. His clothes were disheveled but not torn. His eyes were open but unfocused. When I stepped on a twig, the crack of it sounded too loud in the quiet, and his head snapped in my direction. For a second, we just stared at each other. Then he began to move. He did not sprint. He lurched, legs uneven, but every second he closed the distance. His arms reached out without coordination. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Just a rough exhale. I backed away, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. But I'd seen enough training footage to know that turning my back completely was a mistake. I needed to watch his hands, make sure he did not grab me. He stumbled over a low hedge, fell to one knee, then pushed himself up with an awkward, jerky motion. His focus never left me. It was not recognition. It was not anger. It was just a fixed attention. The wrench weighed heavy at my side. I did not want to use it. I did not want to get that close. Instead, I slid sideways, keeping a tree between us, and increased the distance. When he bumped into the tree, he stopped for a second, pressing his head against the bark, as if confused. That was my chance. I moved faster, cutting across the path and up a slight hill, putting more obstacles between us. When I looked back from the top, he was still near the picnic table, turning in small circles as if he had lost track of me. They were dangerous, but not perfect predators. That fact mattered. The fence around the old water treatment plant came into view a few blocks later, a tall chain-link barrier topped with barbed wire, with a rusted sliding gate that had been chained shut when the facility closed. A faded sign still hung there. Baypoint Water Treatment Facility, No. 2 authorized personnel only. This time, I did not bother trying to find the key. I knew exactly where the fence posts were anchored and where the chain link could be pulled up enough to squeeze under if someone applied enough force. Years of evaluating security weaknesses made it ironic that I was now using them. I checked the street in both directions. No movement, no sound. I pulled the fence up, kicked a rock under it to hold it, and slid through on my stomach, feeling gravel dig into my chest. Once inside, I let the fence drop and walked toward the main building. The plant had been shut down correctly. Doors were closed, windows were unbroken. The yard was overgrown with weeds between the concrete pads, but the large clarifier tanks and filter beds still stood intact. A small brick building near the entrance held the control room and offices. That was where I headed first. The front door was locked, but the glass was reinforced. I circled to the side and found the maintenance entrance. That lock yielded to the same tools I had used at the arena. Inside, the air smelled stale but clean. Dust lay on the desks and control panels. Papers still sat neatly stacked in trays, yellowing around the edges. A wall calendar near the break room showed a date from 3 years earlier, the month the plant had been taken offline. I shut the door behind me and locked it. Then, for the first time since I had left my truck at the evac center, I allowed myself to sit down. The chair creaked under my weight. My hands trembled slightly as the adrenaline began to ebb. My head felt heavy. My left ear rang. Outside, the drone's announcement voice had faded, either because it was too far away now or because it had moved on to another sector. The silence around the plant felt deeper than the silence in the park. It was the silence of a place that had been empty for a long time, now suddenly occupied again. I was alone, but I was alive. The next hours blurred into a series of practical tasks. That was how I kept my mind from focusing on the human cost of the evacuation failure. I inventoried the break room, vending machines, a refrigerator with long-spoiled contents, a cabinet with old coffee, a plastic tub with sugar packets, some bottled water. I found a small storeroom with spare filters and cleaning supplies. I located the backup generator room at the rear of the building. The diesel tank was far from full, but it held enough to run the generator for a while if I rationed its use. The main grid feed to the plant was still active, but I did not know how long that would last. The power companies would be operating with reduced staff, and if they prioritized hospitals and major centers, older facilities like this might be cut out without warning. I followed the conduit map from the control room to the intake pipes, tracking how water had once flowed from the nearby river into the facility, through the sedimentation basins, into the sand filters, and then out to the distribution mains. The intake had been gated and sealed, but the structure was intact. If I could reopen part of it, I could process water for my own use, independent of the failing municipal system. The thought steadied me. A clear plan always did. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the high windows, I had chosen my living space. An office with only one door and a small window, easy to secure. I dragged a filing cabinet against the inside of the door as a secondary barrier. I spread spare jackets and old coats from the lockers across the floor to form a makeshift bed. I did not sleep much. Every time my eyes closed, I saw the evac center crowd surging, the confused infected in the park, the helicopter's searchlight fading as it moved away. When I finally drifted off for an hour or two, it was to a shallow, restless sleep filled with half-remembered alert tones. When I woke fully, the clock on the wall showed just after 9 in the morning. I checked the windows. The plant grounds looked unchanged. The street beyond the fence was empty. I stepped outside to the yard, the wrench on my belt and the small flashlight in my pocket. Even though the sun was high, I walked the perimeter, inspecting the fence, testing the gate. The chain and lock were still intact. From inside the yard, I could see farther down the street than I had last night. A supermarket sign in the distance flickered. Several cars were stopped at odd angles in the intersection, their doors hanging open. I could not hear any drones. I could not see any soldiers. Just the occasional shambling figure far off, moving between parked cars, too distant to be a threat yet. Back in the control room, the power status display showed the grid feed as still active. I knew that could change at any moment. I shut down non-essential circuits and left only the most important ones. A few outlets, some interior lights, and the control systems for the generator and intake valves. My days began to organize themselves into a routine. That routine kept me from thinking too much about what I had lost, about the fact that the people I knew in the city were now either evacuated, reanimated, or hiding in places like I was. In the mornings, I checked the perimeter and walked the interior of the plant. I inspected the structural integrity of the tanks and pipelines, looking for leaks or signs of corrosion. I made a list of every potential vulnerability: windows that could be broken, doors with weak locks, sections of fence that could be pushed down with enough force. I began working on the water system. Using the mechanical drawings, I figured out how to reopen a limited section of the intake line without reconnecting the plant to the entire river flow. I did not need thousands of gallons. I needed just enough to refill a storage tank that I could use for drinking and washing. I located the intake control gate in a concrete pit at the far edge of the property. The manual wheel was corroded but still turned with effort. I opened it only a small amount, just enough to let a slow trickle of water into the primary sedimentation basin. Back in the control room, I monitored the basin depth gauge. The numbers rose slowly. I knew it would take hours to fill enough for the water to reach the sand filters, but that was fine. I had time. When the municipal grid finally failed 3 days later, it happened without ceremony. One moment, the lights in the control room were on. The next, they went out, leaving only the glow from the small battery-powered emergency lamps. The control screens went dark. I waited for the grid to come back. Sometimes outages lasted only a few minutes. This one did not. After an hour of silence from the panel, I accepted that the external line had gone down for reasons I would probably never know. I walked to the rear building and started the backup generator. The engine coughed a few times, then caught. The vibrations traveled through the concrete and up into my boots. The control room panels flickered back to life on the generator feed. The power meter showed a lower capacity, but enough to run the systems I needed if I stayed conservative. I wrote a checklist and taped it to the panel. Hours of generator operation per day, estimated fuel consumption, and a rough projection of how long the diesel in the tank would last. If I limited the generator to a few hours in the morning and evening, I could stretch that fuel over several weeks, maybe more if I turned things off whenever possible. I switched off non-essential lights and learned to live in the dim during day hours, using natural light through the windows. At night, I used battery lanterns sparingly. The infected population around the plant changed over time. In the first week, I saw only a few, mostly drifting along the streets, sometimes bumping against the fence before moving on. Their behavior felt random. They did not seem to react much to my quiet movements inside the yard. By the second week, their movements had become more concentrated along certain routes. It was as if, in the absence of traffic, they had adopted the old pedestrian patterns of the city. They shuffled along sidewalks, clustered at intersections, and occasionally gathered near storefronts. I kept a notebook where I recorded their numbers and paths, as seen from the roof of the control building. I used an old pair of binoculars from the break room, grey hoodie, blue jeans, red jacket, yellow shirt. I tracked them by their clothing as they moved through their loops. In the evenings, when the sun dipped low and the shadows lengthened, their behavior changed again. They slowed down. Some stopped entirely, leaning against walls or slumping to the ground, their heads tilted forward. Their movements, when they made them, were tiny. A finger twitch, a slow shifting of weight. At first, I thought they might be going dormant at night. But around the third night of careful observation, I noticed something else. Every time a sound carried clearly through the cool air, a distant crash, the bark of a dog, or the faint thump of a helicopter somewhere far away, the infected who had been nearly still would snap to greater alertness. Their heads would lift. They would make small, orienting movements. Then they would either begin walking toward the sound or resume their previous position if the sound did not repeat. They were not shutting off, they were conserving. The realization made me even more cautious about noise after dark. I tried to keep track of the passing days, but they began to blur. Without regular news or contact with other humans, time compressed. My world narrowed to the plant and its immediate surroundings. I did my best to maintain my basic hygiene. I used the treated water for washing and flushing toilets while the internal septic system still functioned. I shaved with a dull razor I found in a desk drawer. I changed into clean clothes from the locker rooms when I could, though supplies were limited. Food was a different problem. The break room vending machines gave me an initial cache, sealed snacks, energy bars, small bags of nuts. Nothing that could last indefinitely, but enough to keep me going for a couple of weeks. After that, I would have to venture out. On the 10th day, when the vending machine shelves had more empty spirals than full ones, I sat at the table with my notebook and mapped out the nearest potential food sources. A small grocery on the main road, a larger supermarket 3 blocks further, a convenience store at a gas station, and a few restaurants. Each option had its own risks. The larger the store, the more likely it had been crowded during the early panic, which meant more infected and more chaos. Smaller stores might have been less crowded, but also might already be picked clean by whoever had been desperate enough to break in. I decided to start with the small grocery. If it was too compromised, I would pull back and reassess. I chose my time carefully. Based on my observations, midday seemed to be when the infected moved more slowly, as if the heat and bright light worked against them. Their responses to distant sounds were slightly delayed compared to evening. I prepared my exit. I secured the plant control room and double-checked the locks on all exterior doors. I turned off the generator to conserve fuel and walked to the main gate. The chain and padlock that secured it was still intact, but that worked both ways. It kept the infected out, and it prevented me from easily opening the gate without cutting the chain, which I did not want to do. I needed the gate to remain a barrier. Instead, I went back to the section of fence I had used to enter on the first night. I pried up the bottom of the chain link again, this time using a small steel bar to lift it higher. I wedged a concrete block underneath to hold it. Then I slid under carefully, listening. The street was quiet. The grocery store lay 2 blocks down, its sign tilted at a slight angle. The front windows looked intact from here. No movement. I kept to the edges of the road, moving behind parked cars where I could, the wrench in my hand now instead of on my belt. I tried to keep my breathing steady. When a bird took off from a rooftop and startled me, I stopped and watched for any reaction in the distance. By the time I reached the grocery, I'd seen only one infected, far down a side street, walking away from me. The front doors were glass with metal frames, the type that usually slid open automatically when sensors triggered. With the power down, they sat closed. A handwritten note was taped to the glass. Closed emergency. Go to Civic Complex. I tried the handles. Locked. That was a good sign in a way. It meant the store had not been fully looted. I could have broken the glass, but that would have made noise. Instead, I walked around the side of the building and found the loading dock. The overhead door there was down, but a smaller personnel door beside it had a metal knob and deadbolt. The deadbolt showed tool marks, but it was still intact. Someone had tried to force it and failed. My inspection kit came out again. Working a lock with shaking hands around a corner from potentially reanimated people is very different from doing it during a scheduled site visit, but the basics are the same. Tension, rotation, feel for the pins. The deadbolt turned. Inside, the storage room smelled stale. Cardboard boxes sat in stacks. Some had been opened, others were untouched. I closed the door behind me but did not lock it, in case I needed to get out quickly. I moved through the stockroom and out into the main store area. The front windows let in enough light to see. Shelves near the front had been hit hard. The most obvious items were gone. Bottled water, canned soup, chips, soda. However, whoever had come through in a rush had not bothered with certain things. plain rice in 20-pound bags, flour, dried beans, canned vegetables with labels that did not look appealing, baby formula, multivitamins. On a lower shelf, nearly hidden, I found several large jars of peanut butter still sealed. I loaded a shopping cart quickly but carefully, balancing weight to avoid squeaks from the wheels. I focused on calorie-dense, long-lasting items. Then I pushed the cart back toward the storage room, listening constantly. Near the office door, I paused. A small radio sat on the desk, battery-powered. It was off. I turned the volume knob slowly and pressed the power button. Static filled the quiet. I spun the tuning dial across the band. Nothing. No voice, no music, no emergency broadcast. Just static and occasional bursts of noise that might have been distant interference. The silence on the radio was more unsettling than the silence in the street. Back at the loading dock, I faced the problem of getting the supplies to the plant without making multiple trips. Walking down the street with a full shopping cart would be loud and visible. I left the cart just inside the door and stepped out onto the dock to look around. To the left, a narrow alley ran behind the buildings, connecting to the block behind the plant. It was partially blocked by a dumpster and some discarded pallets, but still passable. The asphalt was rough, but if I went slowly, I might be able to roll the cart along it with manageable noise. I listened for a long time, monitoring the alley and the cross streets. Hearing nothing, I went back in, took a moment to steady my breathing, then pushed the cart onto the dock. The wheels rattled against the edge of the concrete with a noise that sounded overwhelmingly loud in the quiet day. I froze, listening. No answering sound. I eased the cart down the small ramp and into the alley. Every few feet, a wheel hit a crack or a stone and made a clack. Each time, I stopped, watched, listened. A couple of times, I saw figures at the far ends of intersecting streets turn their heads slightly, then go back to their aimless walking. The alley seemed to act as a partial sound shield. By the time I reached the back of the plant property, my arms were shaking from tense effort. I left the cart in the shadow of a wall, lifted the fence, and began transferring items through one at a time, stacking them just inside. It took 3 trips under the fence for everything. As I pushed the last bag of rice under, my good ear caught a new sound, a sort of low, drawn-out groan from the alley. Not a word, just a noise. I turned my head slowly. An infected woman stood at the corner of the building, maybe 30 feet away. Her clothes were stained, her hair tangled. She leaned on the wall with one hand, fingers splayed. Her eyes were half-focused, but they were pointed directly at me. She made the noise again, louder this time. It was not speech. It was a reaction. Somewhere beyond her, I heard another answering sound, and then another, a chain reaction. I did not wait to see how many would gather. I dropped to the ground, rolled under the fence, and grabbed the remaining food boxes. I dragged them away from the fence without standing up, then let the chain link drop back into place. Hands pressed against the fence seconds later, fingers hooked through the metal, faces pushed close. The infected did not climb immediately, but they crowded that section, drawn by the sight and sound of movement. I backed away, heart pounding. The fence rattled as they pushed against it. It held, but the posts shook. After several minutes, when they realized they could not reach me, their intensity dropped. Some drifted away, losing interest. A few stayed, periodically pressing against the fence again, as if their minds were stuck in a loop. That evening, I stood on the roof and watched the section of fence where they had gathered. The cluster had thinned, but even at dusk, a few still lingered, pacing back and forth. I added a new note to my behavior log. They remember locations of stimuli longer than I thought. I also added a new item to my internal list. Avoid repeated visits to the same external location. They may associate patterns. As the days turned into weeks, I became something I had never imagined, the sole operator of a small private utility system in the middle of a dead zone. I fine-tuned the water treatment process, running small test batches, measuring sediment, chlorinating carefully with leftover chemicals from the plant's storeroom. I adjusted flow rates to conserve energy. I learned exactly how long I could run the generator each day without dipping into the fuel reserve too quickly. I rigged a basic rain collection system on the roof, using plastic sheeting and gutters, directing water into clean barrels. It would never fully replace the intake, but it gave me additional redundancy. I set up small planters on the flat section of roof, filling them with soil from the neglected flower beds near the entrance. From the grocery store supplies, I had taken some packets of seeds, lettuce, radishes and herbs. They were not high-calorie crops, but they provided fresh greens and a sense of progress. Watching something grow in the middle of all this helped more than I expected. I also started to build a sound diversion system. The first idea came from the drone. Its repetitive announcement had drawn infected to certain sections of fence early on. If sound could attract them, sound at a distance from my shelter could pull them away. In the storage area, I found several battery-operated sirens intended for industrial alarms. They were designed to be wired into larger systems, but I could power them individually. I removed a few control boards from old equipment and cobbled together a basic timer with on-off intervals. One night, shortly after sunset, I set one of the sirens on a timer and placed it on the far side of the plant property, close to the street, but still behind the fence. I retreated to the roof and waited. When the siren activated, its high, oscillating tone cut through the quiet. Within seconds, infected in the nearby blocks snapped their heads toward the sound. Several began moving in that direction. Some bumped against the fence, pressing against it. They clustered there, reaching through the metal grid. I watched until I could confirm the pattern. As long as the sound continued, they stayed focused on it. Their movements concentrated on that section of fence. When the siren shut off, they lingered for several minutes, then slowly drifted away. In the following days, I refined the setup. I built a few more timed siren units and placed them at different points along the perimeter. The goal was not to toy with the infected. It was to learn how to manipulate their movement without putting myself in unnecessary danger. The drones kept coming, but less frequently. Sometimes one would pass overhead, broadcasting the same recorded message about quarantine and patience. Other times, it would just move silently, its camera pointed downward. I did not wave. I did not shout. As far as the authorities were concerned, anyone inside this zone was already written off. Revealing myself might bring more harm than help. The psychological weight settled in gradually. At first, I had been too busy with immediate survival tasks to dwell on what I had lost. But eventually, when the systems were running and the routines were established, the quiet moments lengthened. In those spaces, my mind dragged me back to the evac center and all the faces there. I thought of the woman who had shouted about her missing husband, the kids with the tablet in the minivan, the nurse with the infrared thermometer who had gone pale when the first breach began. I had walked away from them, ducked into a maintenance hallway, and left them to whatever followed. I knew, rationally, that I could not have saved them. One person with a wrench and an inspection badge was not going to turn the tide of a collapsing evacuation, but logic did not quiet the small voice that asked, late at night, if there was something else I could have done. The hallucinations started around the end of the third week. They were not full visions. I did not see people who were not there. Instead, I began to hear things in the static when I turned on the radio. If I left the tuner on one frequency long enough, the pattern of noise would sometimes almost resolve into a voice. It would sound like my supervisor, asking for a status report, or like Olivia, laughing quietly as she described a difficult shift. By the time I leaned closer, the noise would revert to formless static. One night, while I sat in the darkened control room, with the radio's dial glowing faintly, I could have sworn I heard the evacuation announcement again, word for word, as if it had never ended. All residents in Baypoint and surrounding townships are ordered to report to designated evacuation centers. My hand tightened around the radio casing until my knuckles hurt. I forced myself to reach out and turn the unit off. The silence that followed was almost worse. I knew some of it was my hearing damage. The ringing in my left ear had always filled the gaps in real sound with its own invented tones. Now, in this constant quiet, my brain wanted to fill in the rest. To counteract it, I gave myself structured tasks that required focus. I mapped the underground utility tunnels that connected the plant to other infrastructure points in the area. An old set of drawings in a filing cabinet showed several access points in the drainage network. Some led toward the commuter railway station, others toward the emergency field hospital that had been set up in a large parking lot near the civic complex. The idea of using tunnels as movement routes had appeal. If the infected were mostly above ground, wandering streets and lots, the underground paths might be relatively clear. However, they also held their own hazards, confined spaces, potential for flooding, poor air quality. If something went wrong down there, escape options were limited. I decided to test one short section first, a tunnel leading from the plant's drainage outfall toward a junction under the main road. I prepared carefully. I packed a small backpack with a flashlight, spare batteries, a respirator mask from the chemical storage room, a coil of rope, and a marker to leave directional arrows on the tunnel walls. I rigged a tether at the plant end so that, in theory, I could follow it back if my light failed. The tunnel entrance was secured with a bolted metal hatch. I unfastened it and pulled it open, releasing a wave of cool, damp air. The ladder leading down was rusty but solid. I descended slowly, testing each rung. The tunnel below was tall enough to walk in hunched over, with a shallow trickle of water along the center. The concrete walls were stained but intact. The air smelled stale, but not immediately dangerous. I moved forward in measured steps, shining the light ahead and listening. The sound of my own breathing inside the respirator mask was louder than any noise from outside. Occasionally, the building above creaked as it cooled in the evening air. At the junction, I found a larger chamber where several pipes met. One pipe continued toward the main road. Another branched off toward what I knew was the commuter rail line, and a third rose vertically toward a manhole. I approached the vertical shaft and shone my light up. The manhole cover above was in place, but faint daylight leaked around its edges. I considered climbing up and lifting it a fraction to look around, but the risk of creating noise in the middle of a street intersection stopped me. Instead, I made a chalk mark on the wall, indicating the direction I had come from, and another pointing towards the rail line. Then I turned back. Back at the plant, I sealed the hatch and added the tunnel system to my mental map of options. It was a potential backup route, nothing more yet, but having it made me feel slightly less trapped. Weeks passed, my hair grew longer, my clothes became worn at the edges, my world narrowed even further, and yet, in some ways, I began to know it more intimately than any place I had lived before. I knew exactly how long it took for the afternoon sun to move from the edge of the clarifier tanks to the top of the filter house. I knew how the wind shifted as it came down from the hills behind the city and crossed the river. I knew which sections of fence would rattle if someone brushed them and which would stay quiet. I also knew that the infected behaved differently at night than during the day. My early observations had hinted at it. More detailed tracking confirmed it. During daylight hours, their movement followed loose patterns, almost like slow pedestrians. They drifted along familiar routes, paused at intersections, and responded sluggishly to distant noise. In late afternoon, they became slightly more active, as if something in their altered physiology geared up as the temperature dropped. At night, especially in the hours just after sunset and just before sunrise, their sensitivity to sound and motion increased noticeably. A small noise in the yard that had drawn no reaction at noon would bring 2 or 3 of them to the fence at 9 in the evening. Their walking speed increased slightly, their postures straightened a little, their heads turned more quickly towards motion. The difference was not dramatic enough to be obvious at a glance, but when you watched the same stretch of street every day, it became clear. I logged all of it. It might not matter to anyone else ever again, but it mattered to me. Understanding them gave me a sense of control, however limited. One night, shortly after midnight, That understanding probably saved my life. I had been asleep in the office, the filing cabinet still in place against the door, the radio off for once. A sound pulled me out of sleep, not loudly, but sharply enough to cut through the ringing in my ear. It was a faint, repetitive tapping, followed by a soft scrape. For a second, I thought it was another phantom sound. Then it repeated, slightly louder. I slipped out of the makeshift bed, took the wrench and moved to the office window. Careful not to silhouette myself, I eased one edge of the heavy blind aside and looked out over the yard. In the spill of moonlight across the concrete, I saw movement near the service entrance to the generator building. Someone or something was working at the door handle. I held my breath and watched. The figure was not moving like the infected. The motions were controlled and precise. I saw a hand reach up, insert something into the lock, twist. The door opened a few inches, then wider. The figure slipped inside. My first thought was that it might be a soldier or a police officer, someone finally checking the plant. My second thought, appearing right on its heels, was that if any organized authority was entering this zone at night, they would probably not come alone or quietly. Either way, a stranger inside my shelter could be as dangerous as any infected outside. I went to the office door and eased the filing cabinet aside inch by inch, trying not to scrape it. Then I opened the door a crack and listened. The generator room was on the far side of the building. I moved along the corridor, keeping close to the wall, wrench in my right hand. Shadows from the emergency lights stretched long across the floor. As I approached the corner, I heard a human voice, low and breathless, muttering barely audible words. It sounded like someone counting or reciting under their breath. I risked a quick glance around the corner. A man in his 20s stood near the generator, his back to me. He wore a backpack and had a pistol holstered at his hip. A small flashlight clamped in his teeth cast a narrow beam over the control panel as he read the labels. His hands moved over the switches. I stepped back into the shadow, pulse pounding. He was trying to take control of the generator. For a moment, uncertainty held me in place. This was another survivor. In all the weeks since the evacuation, I had not seen a single uninfected person up close. Part of me wanted to walk in, announce myself and talk. The part that had kept me alive, however, reminded me that a desperate stranger with a gun in my generator room was a direct threat. The generator was my lifeline. If he shut it down improperly, damaged the fuel line, or tried to take the fuel for himself, I could lose everything. Without power, my water treatment would fail, my lights would go out, and my ability to manage the plant would crumble. I decided on a middle path. I would make contact, but I would do it from a position where I had options. I stepped around the corner slowly, keeping the wrench visible but not raised. "Stop right there," I said, keeping my voice even. The man spun around, the flashlight dropping from his mouth and clattering on the floor. His hand flew to his pistol. For a second, we stared at each other in the dim emergency light, both frozen. "Easy," I said. "You pull that, this room becomes a lot more dangerous for both of us." He blinked, breathing fast. "Who are you?" he asked. "Elias Mercer," I said. "This is my plant." "You're..." He swallowed. "I thought this place was abandoned." "It was," I said. "I restarted it. Put your hand away from the gun grip and we can talk." He hesitated, then slowly moved his hand away, palms open. "I'm Ryan," he said. "Ryan Keller. I came from the other side of the city. I saw the lights here at night and followed them." He glanced at the control panel. "I need fuel. My group is running low." "Group," I repeated. The word felt distant, out of place in my world of one. "How many?" "7, he said. "We've been hiding in the freight depot near the rail line. We have some supplies, but the generator there's almost dry. We saw your lights from the loading docks 2 nights in a row. I thought maybe there'd be fuel here." "There is," I said. "And it keeps this place running. You try to take it, we'll have a problem." He spread his hands wider. "I wasn't going to take all of it. Just enough to... I cut him off with a short gesture. If you drag fuel cans through the streets at night, you'll bring half the infected in the district down on you. You know that. He looked away for a moment, jaw tight. We're out of options, he said. The depot isn't as secure as this place. We're running low on clean water. I don't know what I thought. I just saw lights and figured there had to be something. The isolation I had kept like a shield cracked a little at the edges. There were survivors out there, not just one or two hiding in closets. A group. People who might have skills, stories, information. People who might also bring trouble, noise, and unpredictability that my careful systems were not built to handle. Behind Ryan, the generator hummed steadily. The fuel gauge on the tank remained where it had been earlier that evening. I took a slow breath. You found something, I said. That took effort. I respect the effort. But if you touch those controls again without my say-so, I'll throw you out the gate and you can explain yourself to the people outside. He gave a short, humorless laugh. There are not many people out there anymore. I know, I said, which is why we do not want them inside here. He looked at me directly again. So what now? You keep your fortress, and I go back and tell them I came back empty. I studied him. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, clothes that had seen too many days of hard use. But his hands were steady now. He had moved with purpose at the panel. Not random, not reckless. We talk, I said, in the control room, away from the generator. He nodded slowly. As we walked down the corridor, I listened for any changes outside. Footsteps in the yard, the rattle of the fence. Nothing yet. The plant still felt quiet. In the control room, I turned on only one overhead light, keeping the rest of the room in shadow. I sat in my usual chair and motioned for him to take another. He unshouldered his backpack cautiously and set it down at his feet. Up close, I could see a faint scar on his forehead and a strip of fabric tied around his left wrist. How long have you been at the depot? I asked. Since the second day after the evacuation order, he said. We missed one of the convoys. Roads were blocked. We cut to the rail line. Thought maybe we could catch an outbound freight. Never came. We holed up there instead. You hear anything from outside the quarantine? I asked. Radio, aircraft, anything beyond the drones? He shook his head. We picked up a few broadcasts the first week. Evacuation routes, shelter locations, emergency numbers. Then they went quiet. Just the drone messages since then. He looked at my control boards. You've been running this place alone the entire time? Yes, I said. He whistled softly. You must have some skills. Emergency infrastructure inspector, I said. Power substations, water filtration. This facility is almost identical to one I certified 5 years ago. It made sense to use what I knew. He leaned forward. Listen, Elias, I get it. You've set up something that works. You don't want to risk it. But we're running out of safe options. There are kids at the depot, an older man with a bad leg. We've patched the fences with whatever we can find, but we don't have what you have here. Tanks, filters, real walls. If we could pool resources... I held up a hand again. Stop. Before we talk about bringing more people, we need to talk about noise, about movement, about how your group behaves during the day, and, more importantly, at night. He frowned. We're careful, he said. We only move in daylight. We avoid main roads. We keep lights off at night. I told him what I'd observed about the infected's reactions to sound and time of day. I described their increased activity before dawn and after sunset. I told him about the siren experiments and the behavior clustering. He listened, brow furrowing deeper as I explained. We've been hearing them at night more, he admitted when I finished. They gather near the loading dock sometimes. We thought it was random, but maybe they're following patterns we don't see. They are, I said. And if you start moving 7 new people through the streets to here, at the wrong time, you'll drag them right to my fence. Ryan sat back, exhaling slowly. "So what do you suggest?" he asked. "We can't stay where we are forever. We're down to ration bars and whatever canned stuff we find in the rail offices." I looked at the control panel, the generator readouts, the fuel gauge. I thought about the nights of silence and the months I might be able to stretch this plant's resources if I stayed alone. I also thought about the nights when the radio static started sounding like voices, and the way my hearing damage turned the drone announcements into distant echoes. If I brought more people here, I would be giving up some control in exchange for something I had not had since the evacuation: human contact, shared labor, the possibility that if I got hurt or sick, someone else could keep the generator running and the water clean. "If you come here," I said slowly, "you don't come at night. You move at mid-morning when they're slowest. You move in small groups, staggered by at least 15 minutes. No shouting, no engines. Everyone carries what they can and nothing more. And once you're inside, we lay down rules. Quiet after dark, strict routines. Nobody touches the control systems except me unless I train them." Ryan's shoulders eased slightly. "So you're saying yes," he said. "I'm saying maybe," I corrected. "I'll come to the depot with you tomorrow, see it for myself, and meet your people. If it looks like a risk I can manage, we'll plan a move. If not, you take some water and as much fuel as I can spare and go back to trying your luck somewhere else." He nodded. "Fair enough." We sat in silence for a moment. Somewhere outside, a distant thump echoed, followed by a faint chorus of reacting groans, the infected responding to some disturbance we could not see. "What made you leave the line?" he asked suddenly. "At the evac center. You were there, right?" "You must have been, if you got caught behind the quarantine." I thought of the crowded hallway, the nurse with the thermometer, the first infected collapsing and rising again, the decision to step sideways into the maintenance corridor instead of forward into the crush. "The noise," I said. "I've spent years listening to equipment, hearing the difference between normal and about to fail. That night, when the first shouting started, I heard the system failing. I chose another path." He studied me for a moment. "I'm glad you did," he said quietly. "Otherwise, none of us would have seen these lights. There were still 1,000 things that could go wrong. The infected could breach the fence. The generator could fail. The authorities could decide to expand their containment measures in ways that made my careful planning irrelevant. But as I sat there in the dimly lit control room, with another living human being across from me, and the hum of the generator steady beneath our feet, I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel since the helicopter turned away from the evac complex. Not safety. I knew better than that. Just a small, stubborn sense that the quiet zone that the government had written off as lost was not entirely empty. That within its boundaries, against the odds, order and intention still existed, carried by people who refused to lie down and let the systems fail completely. I had survived alone after the evacuation failed. Now I had a choice. Remain a solitary caretaker of a ghost facility, or turn this plant into the core of something new, fragile and risky, but real. In a world where the dead walk the streets outside the fence, that choice mattered more than any inspection report I had ever filed. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.